So now I'm going to read from this book. It's from the American Jewish Archives. Sephardim in the Americas. Martin A. Cohen. Cohen, remember, John Calvin was a Cohen. It became Calvin, eventually Calvin. But it was a Cohen. Guest editor, it says. All right, this is the volume, the year, number 1. So the American Jewish Archives, a journal devoted to the preservation and study of the American Jewish experience. And it lists the people here: Jacob Rader Marcus, PhD, Abraham J. Peck, PhM, Managing Editor, Ruth L. Kramer, Editorial Associate, Tammy Topper, Editorial Assistant, published by the American Jewish Archives on the Cincinnati campus of the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, Dr. Alfred Gottschalk, President. All right, so we're going to hear from the horse's mouth themselves. Introduction. Sephardim in the Americas. The year 1992 and the observance of the Columbus quincentenary mark a special moment in the history of the American Jewish experience. For a brief time, the historical spotlight will be able to shine on a group of American Jews whose ancestors left Spain at about the same time that Columbus undertook his journey of discovery. And while mainstream America will celebrate the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus' discovery of the New World, the same group of American Jews, the Sephardim, will shed tears for the nearly 200,000 Spanish Jews who were expelled in 1492 from a country in which they had lived for many centuries. And who are the Sephardim? Indeed, research in American Jewish history has shown that the first significant Jewish immigrants to this country and to this hemisphere were Jews from the West Indies and Europe, who traced their ancestry to the Jewish communities in Spain and Portugal. So in general, these are not Ashkenazic Jews, all right? Again, Sephardic Moorish Jews. The Sephardim, as they identified themselves according to their prayer ritual, dominated the religious, social, and economic life of American Jewry during the colonial and early federal periods. By the 1830s, however, they were overwhelmed in numbers by a substantial immigration of Jews from German-speaking Central Europe. All right, so then the other Jews started coming in. These German Jews soon developed much of the institutional framework that would serve as the foundation for a future American Jewish community. The earlier Sephardic community soon became part of American Jewish myth. All right, they don't exist. They were viewed as the grandees of American Jewish society, an aristocratic, acculturated group that has now all but vanished as a factor in the American Jewry of the 20th century. So you hear what's going on, right? So this is kind of like what we've been getting to, right? So, a lot of the people of color in the Americas, they descend from a lot of these Sephardic Jews and Moors, people of color. And they had to be crypto Jews, and a lot of time eventually they just anglicized their name and their lifestyle and their culture. They just, and like they're trying to say here, they vanished, right? So look how even in this academic journal, they're letting you know that these people kind of went underground, like the whole history, not just the people, but the whole history. They were here first. They were the ones colonizing. They were here first. Remember, the other people didn't come until after the 1830s. After the 18th, we're talking about almost 200 years, right? 1600s, 1500s, right? 1490s, they were already coming with Columbus. Talking about a lot of years here that these people were the ones actually, like it was saying here, dominant, right? This dominant force. As it says here, in the years between 1881 and 1924, this is a lot more recent, right? Over 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe reached these shores and became the dominant force in American Jewish life. That happened all after. You see what they're telling you here, right? This is from the horse's mouth themselves. This is their own people telling you, yo, we got there. Nah, we didn't get there till the 1880s, 1920s. All right, Ellis Island, all that, that's us. Yeah, we didn't come until then. Before it was the Sephardis. Who's the Sephardis? People of color. All right, so we're going into a whole new history. We got to start seeing things a lot different. All right, they're letting you know. They're letting us know. They didn't get here until 1880s, 1920s. All right, continuing a little further down. All right, it says here, to the exiles, the Hebrew term Sephardi was now applied. So the exiles, we're talking about all these people that got exposed from Spain. All right. The word Sephardi and its generic plural, Sephardim, are simultaneously nouns and adjectives meaning Iberian. So that could be anybody from Iberia, including all the Moors, right? Or in the latter political sense, Spanish. So anybody from Spain. As such, they were previously applied to all Iberians. They were applied to who? All Iberians. Who were the Iberians? Non-Jews and Jews alike, even non-Jews. We're talking about Muslims, Moors, Moorish people, Moriscos, Marranos. Popular usage has typically contracted the words to Sephardi and Sephardim, respectively, and created the English adjective Sephardic. All right? So again, remember, this is from the horse's mouth. We're reading from the American Jewish archives, from the Hebrew University. All right, all these professors with a PhD letting us know. These words are parallel to the terms Ashkenazi, Ashkenazim, and Ashkenasik, referring to German and Eastern European Jews, right? They're different. The word Sephardi derives from the noun Sepharad, a biblical place name which by the 8th century was commonly used by Jews to designate the Iberian Peninsula. All right, so they're letting you know that this word, they started using it to identify Spain and Portugal in the Mediterranean area right there as Iberia in the 8th century. Now look what it told us, it was a biblical place name. Now it says the name Sepharad appears only once in the Hebrew Bible in the 20th verse of the book of Obadiah. There we read, and this host of the children of Israel in captivity shall possess Phoenician territories as far as Zarephath, while the exiles of the Jerusalem community who are in Sepharad shall take over the towns of the south. Now look what it says here. It is not possible to determine the identity of Zarephath and Sepharad and Obadiah. It's not possible. They appear to be the cities Zarephath in southern Phoenicia and Sepharad in Asia Minor. But in the early centuries, the present era, Zarephath and Sepharad came to be identified with the two principal Jewish settlements in Western Europe. So those places, those names were taken somewhere else, were given to other locations in Western Europe. So those weren't the original places, so what they're letting you know here. Zarephath with the French regions. So Zarephath became France. In France. The Roman Gallia. And Sepharad with Iberia. And then Sepharad, which was originally in Asia Minor, actually was changed over to the Spanish-Portugal area. All right, they started calling people Sephardic, the Roman Hispania. By the 8th century, the identification of Sepharad with Hispania, though apparently still not universal, appears to have been successfully common. By that time, also the term Ashkenaz in Genesis 10:3, Jeremiah 51:27, and 1 Chronicles 1:6, originally referring to a land bordering on the Euphrates and Armenia, had come to signify the Germanic areas. From these original immigrants and their descendants, the term Sephardi was gradually extended to denote three other groups: expatriate Iberian Christians who declared themselves Jews, the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula prior to the expulsion, and Iberian Christians under Spanish or Portuguese rule who were presumed to be secret Jews. From this appellation, Sephardi may be further extended to all Iberians of real or presumed Jewish descent who lived and died as non-Jews both in Sepharad and elsewhere. All Iberians, again, all Iberians. That includes Moors, the Moors, who were holding it down, right, in Iberia. The justification for such extension lies in the fact that in large measure the fate of these people and therefore their opinion in life were linked to the reality, or in some cases the presumption, of their Jewish ancestry. We continue in this academic journal, the American Jewish Archives, Sephardim in the Americas. Portuguese Sephardim in the Americas says here in this chapter, says Recife. The year was 1654. Now remember, we got a lot of this already in past videos. This is just more correlation. from the horse's mouth again. For 24 years, the Dutch had held the Bulge of Brazil. Who are these Dutch? Remember that these Dutch were Jews, Protestant Jews. These were Sephardic people and Moors. Had held the Bulge of Brazil that extends into Atlantic Ocean, the province of Pernambuco, where Recife at its capital. Jews from Holland arrived in ever-growing numbers to join new Christians from Portuguese Brazil who had converted to their ancestral faith. Eventually, two congregations were formed, Sur Israel in the island city of Recife, and Magen Abraham on the mainland of Mauritia. By 1641, they had imported from Amsterdam Rabbi Isaac Abod, the Fonseca, and the Haham scholar Moses Rafael de Aguilar, and public Jewish worship was held for the first time in the New World. Synagogues were built as their community grew and flourished. In 1645, however, the Portuguese began a guerrilla campaign that ultimately spelled the end of the Dutch dominion. All right, so remember what we're reading. We're reading this journal from the Jews themselves. So they're leaving out all who these people are. They're just tagging them as Portuguese and Jews. Now remember, these Dutch are Sephardic. These are Jews and Muslims, right? Trying to practice their religion out there peacefully. And the Portuguese right now are represented by the Catholic Empire. So these are Catholic people against Jews and Muslims, right? Remember, they're being persecuted. In this reference, we see them as Portuguese and Dutch. Again, most of these are people of color on both sides. 4 years later, the colony was besieged. 4 or 5 years, the Dutch held out despite starvation and lack of ships and supplies from the homeland. By 1654, when the Dutch surrendered to the Portuguese, the Jewish population, which had peaked at about 1,450 in 1645, had diminished to about 600. The Portuguese commander, Barreto, agreed to give Dutch citizens the right to emigrate within 3 months. Despite a paucity of available ships, every professing Jew left. The majority seemed to have gone to Amsterdam, when some of them returned to the New World. Others had already been trading in Guianas and the Caribbean and found their way to the new homes in these areas. All right, so remember, that was a little of their diaspora in 1654 when the Portuguese or the Catholic Empire regained control of Brazil after the Dutch, so-called Dutch or Sephardic Jews from Amsterdam were already there for years. Let's see, American Jewish Archives, Caribbean Jewry. The Spanish settlements in Mexico and Peru had attracted many Portuguese new Christians, Protestants, new Christians, Sephardic Jews, Moors, no small number of whom were accused by the Inquisition of Judaizing. Of the islands discovered by Columbus, only the larger ones were under Spanish rule in 1654, Cuba Hispaniola, later subdivided as Santo Domingo and Haiti, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago. The Spanish rulers sought gold or other mineral wealth and abandoned their smaller islands to be fought over by Holland, England, France, and Denmark, which made them bases from which to prey on Spanish shipping, carrying the wealth of mainland America. Sephardic communities soon came to be established in many parts of the Caribbean. Since refugees leave few records, it is difficult to document the arrival of the first Jews in any locality. The existence of laws forbidding Jews to live in a place cannot be taken as evidence that there were none there. For Jewish survival has always required ignoring abandoned man-made laws, and living as Jew meant taking risk. Thus, allowed Jews were prohibited from settling in England before 1655, and in most of France after 1390. Secret Jewish communities existed in both countries. In the same manner, refugees from Dutch Brazil undoubtedly found homes in the island provinces before their presence was officially continents. All right, they were hiding. While individual Jews can be found on almost every island of the Caribbean prior to the abandonment of slavery in the mid-19th century, here we shall describe only those areas where congregations were organized and synagogues built. All right, so they were everywhere, but they were just focused on this. Was just a brief info, so you can know, they were going through their own little diaspora and going into all these countries in the Americas, right? Before they went into North America in masses. Continues as Suriname. The legend of El Dorado, a city of gold purported to be in the hinterland of the Guianas, led to feudal explorations by Sir Walter Raleigh and other 16th century adventurers. Pirates, the discovery of well-watered tropical coastland, brought settlers and inevitable fighting among the English, French, and Dutch that eventuated in the formation of 3 Guianas, one belonging to each nation. All right, so again, these are all tags, English, French tag. These are people that have a certain cultural background behind all these people. Got to get specific individually. Suriname, originally British, but Dutch after 1667, may have had Sephardic settlers by 1639. The Amsterdam Jewish archives contain a ketubah. All right, now when they say may have, see, they're leaving out since the 1490s. We're talking about Vespucci and all these people, Colombia, these are all Sephardi settlers. All right, remember that. Don't, so, they're trying to start in the 1600s. No, they were there way before that. The Amsterdam Jewish archives contains the ketubah, marriage certificate from Suriname dated 1643, a shipload of secret Jews from England. All right, a shipload, not Africans. Remember, secret Jews, these are people of color, these are so-called black people, a shipload of so-called black people, just to put it in reference for everybody, came from England, not Africa, came with Lord Willoughby in 1652. Eager for colonists, he had assured them freedom of worship and indemnization of the right to settle and trade. By 1665, they had built a synagogue in Paramaribo, the capital. We had a whole article on Paramaribo, so a whole bunch of information about the Sephardic and Moorish people who settled there. And again, they were bringing in shiploads. This is just one. They were bringing in shiploads of Sephardic families, people, crammed up, because they were desperate to colonize, because these people were very good in business, trade, merchant, and what? Sugar planting, creating plants. Remember, they were getting loans and grants. We got this in my past video. They were getting grants, all right, to go over there and raise sugar for the crown, for the Portuguese crown and Dutch. Farther north in Cayenne in 1662, a colony of Dutch Jews, these are Sephardic people, was organized by Abraham Cohen, a financier, and David Cohen, Nazi. As manager, Nazi was typical of the Portuguese New Christians seeking to flee the Inquisition. So who was fleeing the Inquisition? Moors, right? The Iberians, Sephardic Jews, born in Portugal about 1612 with the name Cristóbal da Tavora. He escaped to Holland and adopted the name Joseph Núñez de Fonseca. So you see how they were changing their name almost completely, all right? Simulating to conceal his trail, or perhaps to protect relatives still in Portugal. He became David Cohen Nazi. Nazi was the founder of a prolific and important family in the Dutch colony. His sons Samuel and Joseph Cohen Nazi became military leaders in the Guianas and played a major role in the founding of Suriname's second congregation in 1605. In the hinterland, upriver from Paramaribo, at what came to be known as the Joden Savane, again a synagogue was built, the ruins of which, along with a cemetery, can still be seen in the jungle. The census taken in 1694 shows the Dutch colony of Paramaribo as having 92 Sephardic families and a dozen Ashkenazic ones. All right, what was more? Sephardic. The following century brought such growth that the Ashkenazim opened congregation Nev Shalom in 1734. The community's prosperity brought a rise in anti-Semitism, despite the fact that Jewish militia units had helped to defend the colony against slave uprisings. All right, so it keeps going with this information. Then we're talking about Barbados. Barbados is one of the islands for which there is documentary evidence of the arrival of refugees from Brazil. In the minutes of the Barbados Council for November 8, 1654 can be found ordered that the consideration of the Jews and foreigners brought from Barcel to the island be presented at the next sitting of the governor and assembly. All right, now remember, again, a reference. Now, this is very important, Barbados. Why? Because a lot of these people from Barbados, these planters in Barbados, who were actually refugees from Brazil, Dutch refugees, so-called Dutch, they were actually Dutch Jews, they were Sephardic Moors, they were Moorish people, Sephardic, Portuguese, and Spaniards that were running away from Brazil or just coming directly from Amsterdam, settling in here in Barbados, right? Eventually, they would make their way to South Carolina and other parts of North America. Same people, all right, in Barbados. So it says in January 1655, months before England sanctioned their presence, it was enacted that the Jews of Barbados, provided that they behave themselves, you guys better behave yourselves, civilly and conformably, to the government of this island, shall enjoy the privileges of laws and statutes of the Commonwealth of England and of this island relating to foreigners and strangers. So they were allowed to settle there. You think it was just because they were feeling bad for them? Again, remember, these people were the ones planting sugar. These people were the ones with the connections worldwide. The network, the merchants, port Jews, remember? Port Jews, or Huguenot Protestant, or the Protestant International Merchants. In April of 1655, Oliver Cromwell issued a pass to Dr. Abraham de Mercado and his son David to go to Barbados to exercise his profession. Both had been residents of Recife. All right, what is the profession? Grow sugar. Returned to Amsterdam, then lived for a time on the island. So he had experience. They're like, yo, Oliver Cromwell's like, hey, can you go set up shop over there now in Barbados? Thanks. Just like you did in Brazil, Recife. The doctor returned to Amsterdam a second time and died there in March 1669. David died in Barbados in 1685 and was buried in the Jewish cemetery. By the end of the 17th century, the Jewish population of Barbados had grown to 250, sizable for an island that measured only 14 by 21 miles. Its Jewish community was organized by another refugee from Recife, who later returned to Amsterdam, known as Luis Diaz, alias Joseph Jesurun Mendes, alias, aka, what is it? Luis Diaz. Luis Diaz, all right? Born in Portugal in 1616 as Ludovico Luis Guterres. Mendes settled in the Bridgetown with his wife and 6 children. So his name was completely different when he was born. By the early 1660s, he had prevailed on his fellow Jews to found congregations. Nidhi Israel, the scattered of Israel, purchase ground and erect a synagogue, following the traditional pattern of English churchyards. Their cemetery, subsequently enlarged, surrounds the synagogue on 2 sides. All right, so there's a little history about Barbados. Continuing, it says here, Martinique, all right, another of the islands in the Caribbean. It says a few of Recife's refugees found their way to Martinique, where they were joined by Portuguese Jews from southwestern France. There was, see how they were just meeting up, like I said. They didn't just come from Brazil. They weren't just refugees from Brazil, all right? So again, these refugees, they were probably being called Dutch, and then these people were being called Portuguese. So then you forget that these are all Sephardic Moors. These are, again, tags, right? Letting you know they're meeting up. Encouraged by Colbert King Louis the 14th's minister, the community grew. By 1676, was able to build a synagogue in the capital town of St. Pierre. That same year, Benjamin da Costa, the Da Costa family, we know they were being labeled mulattoes in the States. A lot of them came through Ireland. They were like the Irish mulattoes. The Costas were actually Portuguese Jews. All right, they labeled mulattoes, people of color. Andrade, so Benjamin da Costa Andrade went to Amsterdam to acquire both a bride and a Torah scroll, which he brought back to the island. A 1680 census lists 80 Jews. A subsequent one 3 years later lists 96. But in 1685, the Jesuits who controlled trade in the French colonies took advantage of Colbert's loss of power to persuade the king to introduce the Code Noir, or the Black Codes. So the Code Noir was not because of Africans or any people they were calling so-called black. It was mainly because who was there? Who was there before the Jesuits? Who wanted to get... They did that because of the Jews that were there. All right? They did it because of the Sephardic, Moorish people of color that were numerous in this island of Martinique. So the Jesuits, again, persuaded the king to introduce the Code of Noir, the Black Code, banishing all Jews from French colonies, the Black Code. These same Black Codes was the same ones they went and brought up to North America, same Black Codes. These were for the Jews, so-called Jews, people of color, Black Codes, to get rid of them, banish them from the French colony, the Black Codes. Majority of them left for Curacao. Any surviving traces of this short-lived community disappeared when St. Pierre was wiped out in the eruption of Mount Pelée in 1902. The history was erased. What happened? Who was the Black Codes for? All right, so another island is Curacao. There's whole articles on the people of Curacao, in their settlers, the Sephardic settlers. You know, from a Jewish standpoint, Curacao is the most important island in the Caribbean. From a what? From a Sephardic Jewish standpoint. It has maintained a functioning Jewish community for nearly 3.5 centuries. From its historic Mikef Israel synagogue went founders of other Jewish communities. Rabbis, canons, and financial aid were supplied to struggling North American congregations. By 1745, Curacao's Jewry numbered 1,500, more than the entire Jewish population of contemporary North America. A Dutch fleet captured Curacao from the Spanish in 1634. Who was this Dutch fleet? Who was in the ships? Who was these pirates? Sephardic Jewish pirates, Dutch Protestant international merchants. On board as interpreter was a Portuguese New Christian, Samuel Cohen, and his boy, Samuel Cohen, all the same people who had lived in Brazil in the 1620s and was fluent in Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese, as well as Indian dialects. Look at that. Cohen searched the island unsuccessfully for gold and returned to Amsterdam, leaving behind at least one other known New Christian, Juan or Julio de Araujo, who moved on to Mexico. In 1651, the Dutch West India Company, who was its founders and main shareholders, all right, Sephardic Jews were very involved in this. The Dutch West India Company, again, they're letting us know something here. Let's see what they're going to say. In 1651, the Dutch West India Company contracted with João de Ilan, a former New Christian, he's not a New Christian anymore, who had been active in the Brazil trade, to bring 50 Jewish settlers to the islands. I told you they were doing this, settling people, Sephardic Jews, full of shiploads of Sephardic Jews. But he succeeded in enticing only 12. Discouraged by the island's barren soil, they all left. 8 years later, Isaac da Costa in Amsterdam enlisted 70 fellow refugees from Brazil to establish Curaçao's first permanent Jewish settlement. Some of their descendants are still there as members of the synagogue. All right, we continue in the book American Jewish Archives, Sephardim in the Americas. And this is in Jamaica now. It says Jamaica remained a Spanish possession from its discovery by Columbus until the British capture in 1655. Thereafter, it became the largest Caribbean island open to Jewish settlement until the Spanish-American War in 1898 liberated Cuba and Puerto Rico. Individuals of Marrano origin settled in Jamaica throughout the Spanish period. Okay, Marranos were settling in Jamaica, Marranos, Black Latinos. When the English conquered the island, they noted that about half the white population were Portugals. All right, so dodge the hijack. Because I want to see the original writing. Where's the footnote? Did they really say white or did they say European population? Because we know these Portugals, in parentheses as they have them here, Sephardic Jews, were people of color. It says one of them, Captain Campo Sabata, guided the invading British fleet into Kingston Bay to capture the capital, St. Jago de la Vega, which they renamed Spanish Town. The Spanish surrender was negotiated by Acosta, a New Christian, who succeeded in having all the Spanish residents banished except the Moors, except the Moors, right? All right, so it says Port Royal at the mouth of Kingston Bay was the first spot in Jamaica to attract Jewish settlers, who were granted rights by Cromwell, later confirmed by King Charles II of England. Now, you remember we read in the previous video King Charles' mom describing her son as a very dark boy, the black boy. Jews immigrated from all parts of the Caribbean, as well as from England. By the late 1660s, a cemetery had been secured across the bay at Hunts Bay, where the oldest surviving grave dates to 1672. An attempt to restore the cemetery in 1938 has long since given way to squatters in tropical growth. Kahal Kadosh Nif Tzedek, the Holy Congregation, the abode of righteousness, was the name taken by Port Royal's Jews for their congregation and for the synagogue they erected in 1676. The name was probably chosen to counteract Port Royal's evil reputation as a haven for pirates and other criminals. Preying on the Spanish galleons carrying the riches of Mexico and Peru to Europe proved a very lucrative trade for some of the town's inhabitants. But Port Royal's prosperity was seriously diminished by a destructive earthquake in 1692. The synagogue was rebuilt, but the town was destroyed again by a fire in 1815. All right, so a lot of history in Port Royal, Jamaica, with the Jews there. All right, and it's interesting, they're telling you, pirates. Remember who the pirates were? Who the people navigating? Who was mooring ships? Meanwhile, many of the Port Royal Jews left after the earthquake and settled Spanish Town. The Sephardim soon founded a new congregation there, Nevis Shalom, or Sephardim, a body of peace, and were able to erect a synagogue by 1704. The Ashkenazim separated themselves into Congregation Mikvel Israel and built their own synagogue 2 years later. Alright, so they had their own thing. The growth of sugar industry enlarged the Jewish immigration, and a number of Jews became plantation owners. Remember, they were the ones producing and teaching everybody how to grow it, how to set up a plantation system. More than a dozen scattered Jewish cemeteries attest to the location of Jews in many towns. Montego-based Congregation Beth Jacob, House of Jacob, erected a synagogue in 1844, but by the end of the century there were too few Jews to keep it open. Alright, so a lot of history there with the Jews, the Sephardic Jews ending up in the Spanish and Portuguese Jews ending up in Jamaica. Now it says here Nevis, another island, says the existence of a 17th century synagogue on the island of Nevis was comparatively unknown until this author learned of it serendipitously. In 1957, he served a chaplain on a cruise ship sponsored by the Virginia State Chamber of Commerce, which was endeavoring to promote the 350th anniversary of the settlement at Jamestown. The cruise's itinerary included the places visited by Captain John Smith's expedition en route from England via the Caribbean to Virginia in 1607. Among these was Nevis. The author already knew details substantiated in his son's biography of him, that Alexander Hamilton, born out of wedlock on Nevis, remember I did a video on Alexander Hamilton, he was Sephardic Jew and Huguenot, basically same thing. Born out of wedlock on Nevis, had been denied admission to the Anglican school there and thus had been educated at the island's synagogue. He grew up like a Jew. When our cruise ships arrived in the harbor of Charleston, we asked to be shown the location of the synagogue. A black native designated vine-covered ruin as the Jews' school. This was connected by a path known as the Jews' Walk to an overgrown field in which goats were feeding, labeled our guide as Jews' burying ground. There the author and his wife discovered 16 flat tombstones in Portuguese, Hebrew, and Elizabethan English, which they copied and subsequently published. Jews were in Nevis as early as 1671, when the British separated the administration of the Caribbean islands into leeward and windward. The presence of mineral springs made Nevis a popular health resort, and the population grew. A muster roll from 1678 lists 5 Jewish heads of families. A decade later, the community had enlarged sufficiently to erect the synagogue. The outbreak of tropical disease followed in 1707 by French raids may have taken a toll of Jews, but in 1723 the Anglican minister reported to England that 1/4 of the island's white population was Jewish, with the Jews catering well to the plantation owners but resented by the Christian merchants. And then it says the islands of St. Eustatius and St. Martin. So starting in 1660, Jews from Curacao began to settle on the Dutch island of St. Eustatius. Although driven out by the French in 1709, they soon returned because of the island's rich soil and because of the harbor of Oranjestad, offered convenient trading with neighboring British, French, Danish, and Spanish islands. All right. A census of 1722 showed 21 Jews. These acquired the cemetery still visible. All right, so they were there too, in these islands. And then we got St. Croix and St. Thomas. St. Thomas was colonized by Denmark in 1772 because it is the closest to Europe of all the Caribbean islands. It was a strategic lair for privateers preying on Europe-bound vessels. In 1684, Gabriel Milan, a Jewish soldier of fortune, was appointed governor of St. Thomas by the Danish government. But after 2 years of misrule and apparently criminal behavior, he was brought back to Copenhagen, tried and hanged. In 1733, the French sold St. Croix to Denmark. When the official documents reached St. Thomas a year later, the governor sent Emmanuel Vaz, a Jewish resident, to Martinique to complete the negotiations with the French colonial governor. There is evidence of a synagogue at Christianstadt on St. Croix by 1760, but the Jewish community had disappeared before the end of the 19th century. An overgrown cemetery had 11 decipherable epitaphs dating between 1779 and 1867. All right, so you know how they say the Maya disappeared, this tribe disappeared, now the Sephardic Jews are disappearing. You see what is going on? So did they really disappear? All right, and now we got Haiti. In 1697, Spain ceded the western third of the island Columbus had named Hispaniola to the French. They restored its Indian name, Ayatí. Under Spanish rule, Marranos were to be found on the northern coast at Isabela. There was Marranos there. Despite France's Black Code, despite the Black Code prohibiting Jewish settlement, there are indications of Jews doing business with almost every port on the island during the 17th and 18th centuries. Again, this Black Codes that France put on not only in Martinique, but also in Haiti and all their territories, it was basically targeted to the Sephardic Jews and Moors, these Black Codes, all right? The Gardis and Mendes families of Bordeaux maintained trade depots after the 1750s. A tax list dated January 16, 1765 shows 29 Jewish heads of families in Cap Haitian plus 8 others as either plantation owners or widely scattered areas. Cap Haitian undoubtedly had a congregation and cemetery, but the Black Uprising of 1790 slaughtered or scattered Haiti's white population. All right, so again, they want us to think in this journal, American Jewish Archives, that all the Jews they've been talking about, these Marranos and all this stuff, like we don't know what Marranos mean, are white people. All right, so it's not a black and white world like they want us to picture it, or war in this time, this uprising. The majority of the surviving Jews migrated to other islands or to the North American mainland. All right, now it moves on to what? British North America. All the communities described so far were totally dominated by Sephardim. All those islands, all those countries, all those islands, all those places, all those colonies, what? Were totally dominated by who? Sephardim. Remember, Sephardim was any Iberian, any person from Portugal, any Moorish or Jewish person from Spain or Portugal. All right, people of color. They what? Totally dominated them. They totally, all right, they were there, still there, a lot of their descendants. So again, all the communities described so far were totally dominated by Sephardim through much of their history, although almost all of them had an admixture of Ashkenazic settlers. North America was different in this respect. The colonial communities were totally Sephardic, but the rapid accretion of Ashkenazim soon outnumbered the Spanish Portuguese. All right, so again, what was going on in North America? It was totally what? Totally Sephardic. Eventually, it became Ashkenazi, but first it was totally Sephardic. When Ashkenazim outnumbered the Spanish and Portuguese, and as we shall demonstrate, often challenged Sephardic domination in America until well into the 19th century. However, the Sephardic Minchad rite was the American way of Jewish worship in the congregations we shall describe. All right, now we're in this book, and this is a genealogical history. Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America. Right in the preface of this book, second paragraph, just want to read here, it says, in this work, we present a series of colonial documents, contemporary first-hand accounts, records, portraits, family genealogies, and ethnic DNA test results, which fundamentally challenge the national storyline depicting America's first settlers as white, British, and Christian. All right, they weren't white or British or Christians. All right, you guys ready? We postulate that many of the initial colonists were of Sephardic Jewish and Muslim Moorish ancestry, usually arriving as crypto Jews with their religious adherents disguised as crypto Muslims. All right, disguised as crypto Muslims, Moors. These immigrants served in prominent economic and political, financial, and social positions in all of the original colonies. The evidence in support of this radical new narrative begins with an examination of the British colonial companies organized in England to bring settlers to North America and exploit the natural riches believed to be there. All right. So now, if you've been following me for a while, you guys kind of already know I have a background. Nations of the World video have a background of where these Sephardic Jewish are coming from. What's their story? How did they become British? How did they become Christian? How did they get erased? Remember, they were saying they vanished. They don't exist anymore. How did they just disappear all of a sudden? If they were the initial colonists, where did they go? Where's their history, right? So we got a background, a big background. I'm glad I did all those other videos before this. Of course, both Spain and France had already made forays into North America, found in St. Augustine and exploring parts of the coastline as far north as Newfoundland. Though their activities as foreign powers are given short shrift in our Anglo-centric version of the birth of America, what is even less frequently mentioned regarding the Spanish and French settlements and voyages is that many of the colonists and sailors were Sephardic Jewish and Muslim Moorish descent. That's what they weren't letting us know. It wasn't frequently mentioned that these were actually Sephardic Jewish and Muslim Moorish descent. All these navigators, sailors. Several of those on board Christopher Columbus' first voyage in 1492, and famously even Colon himself, were Jewish ancestry. And we ain't talking about Ashkenazi here. We're talking about people of color. We're talking about Iberians. They were Jews or crypto Jews. Crypto Jews. One historian of Inquisitional Spain and biographer of Christopher Columbus, Simon Wiesenthal, notes that throughout the 16th century, the movement of the Marranos to the New World had continued, and that after the expulsion of the Jews and flight of the Marrano element, it was the turn of the Moriscos to serve as scapegoats for the ills of society. Scapegoats. The same writer estimates that all told, Spain lost 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people as a consequence of the purification of its population of Jews and Moors. Where did all these people end up? All these people of color. Many occupations were virtually abandoned, he writes. Trade, the crafts, the sciences languished. Moreover, since the branches of endeavor had been domain of Jews and Moriscos, they had become in themselves suspect. Spaniards had to be extremely careful about entering any of these fields. Spanish life as a whole was the worse for these injustices. Spain was swamped with fortune hunters from all parts of Europe, but they could not revive the Spanish economy. Just as the irrigation canals dug by the Moors in Andalusia were allowed to silt up, so the very channels on which the country's health depended fell into neglect. You hear that? We document that Spain's loss was Britain's gain. Beginning with the initial planning, organization, and promotion of the first British colonial efforts, Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors were present as navigators, ship captains, sailors, metallurgists, cartographers, financiers, and colonists. All right, that's big right there. You hear this? This is the real history. I hope you guys see. Again, we're learning a lot. It's just coming all out. This is real history right here. Who was all these captains, all these people providing their ships, their skills in navigation? Who were all these people that they didn't mention to us? A lot of these were people of color, so-called black people that they left out of history. Because they wanted you to think these were all white Europeans. So they were a big part of the initial colonial efforts, all right? Among these we find Joaquim Gans, Simon Ferdinando, Walter Raleigh, Sephardic Jew, Walter Raleigh, John Hawkins, Sephardic Jew, Humphrey Gilbert, Richard Hakluyt Sr. and Jr., Francis Drake, Martin Frobisher, and Abraham Ortelius. The first and second British colonies in North America, Virginia and Massachusetts, were provisioned, funded, and peopled by persons of Sephardic, Jewish, and Muslim Moorish descent. Again, man, I'm going to highlight this. I hope you guys, I'm going to go slow so we can get this, so you guys can understand all this, all right? So we have a lot of background before this. If you're new to this information, make sure you watch my previous videos, but we have all the history behind this. Current genealogical studies of the Appalachian descendants of these early colonists demonstrate that they carried DNA haplotypes, male or female lineages, and genes from Sephardic, Ottoman, and North African founders. Further, these early North American colonists often bore straightforwardly Jewish and Muslim surnames. Attested are Ali, Alif, Saracen, Moises, Bagsel, Hagara, Okazant, and even Saladin. Indeed, given the patently non-Christian backgrounds of so many settlers up and down the Atlantic coastline, non-Christian backgrounds of the American colonies all along the Atlantic coastline, all right, it becomes difficult to ignore the significant declarations of religious tolerance inscribed in the U.S. Constitution. You see why, even in particularly New York, founded by the Dutch, as New Amsterdam was heavily peopled by Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors. New York, all right, understand this. There's the presence of persons from these ethnic affiliations on the governing boards of the Dutch West and East India companies. Again, another source letting us know who was running things in the Dutch West and East India companies. Again, Sephardic Jews had their hands all over this. Muslim Moors had their hands all over these companies. They included Jonathan Cohen or Cohen and Cornelius Spielman, another classic Jewish name. Other New Amsterdam and later New York residents were Jacob Abrahamson and Dennis Isaacson. We present contemporaneous testimony suggesting that even the leading Knickerbocker families of the New York colony, the Van Cortlands, Phillipses, Van Rensselaers, Delano's, and the Lanceys were Sephardic ancestry. All these prominent families of New York were what? Sephardic ancestry, Iberian people. This fresh look at colonial American genealogies and settler lists present for the first time in one source the Spanish, Hebrew, Arabic, and Jewish origins and meaning of more than 5,000 surnames. More than 5,000 surnames. You hear this? The vast majority of them widely assumed before to be sturdy British family names of ancient bearing. Many of our name etymologies plainly contradict the standard reference works. The decipherment of surname history is an involved subject, one that can extend over centuries of transformation in several countries and require knowledge of a multitude of languages. You hear that? Do you have that knowledge? And that's what we've been doing in the last 4 or 5 years. All of us. Combining all our knowledge in the different languages with the different sources and everything. For instance, in order to understand the sea change suffered by the ancient Jewish name Phoebus to English Phillips, Scottish Forbes and Frobisher. We already know Forbes, right? We got it in the last video, Farabas. That's a Moroccan name, Forbes. With stages along the way of Farabas and Farabi and Furby, one must have an appreciation for the synthesizing religions of the Roman Empire, including the cult of Mithras, a naming practice of the Greek-speaking congregations of Jews, as well as conversion of Berber populations to Judaism. Berber populations converting to Judaism. Conquest of Spain by Berber armies in 710 and subsequent development of Judeo-Arab culture. Not to mention the medieval French Norman, all right, the Normans, who's these Normans, Anglo-Saxon and Scottish linguistic. We got all that background already, right? Orthographic and social filters, the surname passed through until it became enshrined in modern times as good old English Phillips. You hear that? So Phoebus eventually became Phillips, and it has a whole history there that it just mentioned. All right, we're in the introduction of the book. Again, this is Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America, a genealogical history by Elizabeth Hirschman and Donald Yates. And right here it says, despite the small nucleus and founder effect, both the Normans and American colonists were extremely diversified in their rank and file. All right, so they're talking about how the Normans invaded England and how these English eventually came into Americas, but both these Normans and these later English colonists who came to the American colonies were very diversified. The former included Danes, Vikings, Norwegians, Flemings, Picards, Bretons, Frenchmen, many from Toulouse and Aquitaine. In the south, the region called Languedoc. All right, Languedoc, big part where the Sephardic Jews and Muslims went after they were expelled, and the Huguenots became, and a number of Spanish or French Jews and Muslims, right? So the last mentioned typically operated the armories, mints, and construction industries while supplying most mercantile professions with a strong component, as well as all banking personnel and civil servants because of their literacy and fluency in accounting. Remember, they were the ones taking care of all that. A little further down here, it says here, the largest emigration of all occurred with the so-called Huguenots, who, as we shall see, were in many cases second or third generation Spanish and Portuguese Jews, the Huguenots, who traded the French colors for English. So they went from Spanish to Portuguese to representing France, And then from there, representing England, they traded the French colors for English, Flemish, then Flemish, or some other nationality as they fled religious persecution. So they were switching up anywhere they went, assimilated, amalgamating. Continuing, says here, in addition to Jewish genealogies, we have made an effort to bring to life some of the forgotten women who shaped the colonial American experience. These include the ancient mother of European royalty, the Occitan Jewish Queen Ita, or Ita, Charlemagne's great-great-grandmother, Mary Lago, the Sephardic Jewish mother of the Quakers founder George Fox, right? His mom, the founder of the Quakers, his mom was Sephardic, so he was Sephardic. And Malaya Cooper, the Jewish mulatto wife of Daniel Boone's guide, whose Hebrew name is the same as one of President Barack Obama's daughters. Some of their stories will surprise readers, running counter to traditional historical accounts. Few people realize that one of the Salem witches mounted a legal defense using the family's professional connections and wealth. Sarah Town, Clays, fought her accusers and lived to become a founder of the town of Framingham, Massachusetts, all right? The mother of Patrick Henry, according to diarist William Byrd, was a handsome woman of the family of Esau. She was an Edomite, whose first husband in Aberdeen, Scotland, was of the family of the Saracens. Says the Cherokee beloved woman, Nancy Ward, bore an Arabic name. One of the sub-themes of the present study is the interaction between immigrants and American Indians. All right, listen to this. Between immigrants and American Indians. All right, readers will find Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and other genealogies that reflect intermarriage between Jews or Muslims and America's native inhabitants. All right, believed in thinking of the day to be Abraham's children. Who's Abraham's children? The America's native inhabitants, the Hebrews. Who? America's native inhabitants. They were assimilating, mixing in, and marrying with the American Indians, these same Sephardic Moorish people.